Either that or, like most business people, you listen to their advice and then you do what you want. Yeah. My name is John Morgridge. I'm the chairman of Cisco Systems and perhaps more importantly the CFO of the TOSA Foundation, which is a private family foundation. And it's my pleasure to invite you, or to welcome you to this, the fifth plenary session on partnerships for sustainable economic development. It is, I think, finally well known that in the world today, it is the private sector that is the dominant engine of growth, the principal creator of value and meaningful resources. As most politicians have stated, it's the economy dummy. Now, Kofi Annan perhaps states it a little more succinctly. If the private sector does not deliver economic growth and economic opportunity, equitable and sustainable around the world, then peace will be fragile and social justice a distant dream. I think we all understand and appreciate the importance of that in today's global world. On the other side of the ledger, business increasingly recognizes that social and environmental responsibility is no longer an option, but a self-enhancing imperative. The Cisco Foundation had its meeting day before yesterday, and one of the key themes of our evolving foundation at Cisco is corporate social responsibility, the meaning of it, and how best we as an organization can make it a reality in our dealings. Therefore, if we are to have real sustainable development, then the private sector needs to get involved. But the private sector clearly can't do it alone. We at Cisco, and indeed I think all of us here, have repeated the theme of the importance of the three-legged stool, the partnering of government, civil society, and business. This panel indeed represents those three important legs of the stool. I know some of you are familiar with the Cisco Networking Academy program, now about 7 years old, that is active in over 150 countries, has some 500,000 students enrolled, and currently has about 16 semesters of curriculum that are provided. It's a reality because of the partnering. And it's been unique to us because it's brought very new partners to us. Partners like UNDP, partners like USAID, people that we as a business probably would never directly be partners with, but through our outreach in this program, they are a key to our mutual success. Partnerships allow us to leverage not only our own assets, but those of our partners. And clearly in the Academy program and in many of the programs that now are evolving around the world, it's that ability to partner, to capitalize on the assets of others and unlock them in very unusual ways. This morning we're going to spend some time talking about how through partnering you can accomplish goals and unlock unique assets of the various partners. We have three individuals who have had considerable experience and will be sharing their insights and wisdom with us this morning. To start off with, Bruce Jenks, Assistant Administrator, Bureau of Resources and Strategic Partnership, United Nations Development Program. Our second speaker will be Bo Cutter, Managing Director of Warburg Pincus, and our final speaker will be Iqbal Moor Ali, CEO of the Ali Khan Foundation, USA. To kick it off, we'll start off with the government sector and Bruce Jenks.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I thought that I would try and focus on a couple of critical points that I wanted to share with you. And the first one relates to the basic theme of this conference, which is partnership. And we don't believe that it's accidental that partnership has become so central in the way we talk about development today. If you go back a while and you look at the Cold War period and the period of decolonization in the 60s, 70s, going into the 80s, there was a real emphasis on filling development gaps, on providing filling financial gaps, providing different types of human skills. And a lot of what we measured in those days related to delivery. People were obsessed with delivery rates in terms of performance of development organizations. And actually, if you think about it, if you're obsessed with delivery, partnering is a little bit of a pain. I mean, it's actually quite likely to slow you up. And this relationship went to the core of the way we actually did our business. As we move into the 90s, and we have a situation with the emergence of globalization, with the end of the Cold War, there was a readiness to look much more at common goals. This was a wonderful opportunity, in a sense, that we all had. And the interesting thing when you go to goals, when you become goal-driven, is that partnership comes out of being goal-driven, because you actually can't meaningfully look at achieving a set of results on the ground and not do it with your other partners who are working on the same issues. So there is an intrinsic relationship, in a sense, between the two. Partnership, therefore, today is not just a buzzword. It's not just part of a PR exercise or filling in a piece of capacity that you don't have. Partnership really relates to the basic business model that you choose. I understand that Jim Wilkinson on the opening evening and Jeff Sachs later on today both touched and in a sense frame the discussions with this Millennium Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the Millennium Development Goals are very interesting because they represent in a way the convergence of the international community's readiness to establish a set of common goals with the principle that this can only be done through partnership, with the need to do the measurement. Because the other interesting thing about setting goals is that measurement follows. If you have a clear set of goals, you have no excuse for not being measured and not really looking at whether you're making a difference on the ground. That takes me in a way to my second point, which is how the focus on goals and partnerships has really, I believe, come to define a large part of the United Nations work in the development field today. And this, I think, is something which is radically new and, again, relates to this evolution in the overall political economy that I was touching on. I think the breakthrough really was in the year 2000 with the Millennium Declaration, that declaration that was signed by 180 or whatever the number is, heads of state and government, and the Secretary General's report that came out at that time, which some of you may be familiar with. And that report was truly a breakthrough report because it really made the argument that the UN has to look out and that the solutions lie in partnerships and in working on the outside. It was one of the more extrovert or outward-looking reports that we've seen for a long time. If you look at the global conferences that followed from that, in particular I'm thinking of the Monterey Financing for Development Conference and the Joburg Conference, we saw for the first time very explicit language on the importance of partnerships and on this kind of extrovert way of looking at the world. Joburg, as you may recall, included in the actual documentation this idea that the building of partnerships would be a fundamental output and result of the conference. Today, I think we're witnessing another dimension of this UN, of this phenomenon of the United Nations reaching out in a new way, and that is this multiplication, plethora of special commissions that have been set up. There is the Commission on Challenges and Threats. There is the Cardoso panel on relations with civil society. There is the work of Jeff Sachs on the Millennium Project, which you'll hear about later. There is the Private Sector Commission, which I will come back to in a second. If you stop and ask the question, why is it that in this very short period, all of a sudden there's this huge explosion of special commissions with very eminent people, I would put it to you that what's happened is that the United Nations finds itself in a situation where we have to find new ways of bringing different kinds of people in, of reaching out in a different way. And since we don't have the institutional mechanisms really set up yet for that, it gets expressed in this other way of doing business, which is reaching out, forming these groups, and trying to develop new types of partnerships. Let me use as an example of what I'm trying to say, the launch on Monday, this last Monday, of the Secretary General's Commission on the Private Sector and Development. This was a report which was launched by the Secretary General, by the two co-chairs of the Commission, Paul Martin and Ernest Zedillo, and Mark Malloch-Brown with UNDP. And the commissioners were quite a remarkable group. They included people like Bob Rubin, Fernando de Soto, C.K. Prahalad, Kali Fiorina, Rajat Gupta, and others. The core message of this commission report is very simple. I believe it's powerful and it's unexpected from the UN. And it is reverting back to the issue of the Millennium Development Goals, that these goals cannot be met without unleashing the entrepreneurial prowess everywhere in the world. This is not, it's very important, this is not an ideological statement. This is not an ideological assertion. It is rather an empirical observation. First, the great bulk of the poor actually live in the private sector and are the private sector. In countries with GDP per capita between $100 and $500 per year, micro-enterprises and SMEs represent about 75% of all employment. Secondly, the poor in developing countries have actually less access to public sector services than citizens of developed countries. 63%, for example, of healthcare expenditures in the poorest countries is private, and that's about twice the OECD average. Third, the poor pay more for goods and services than the richer. In Mumbai, slum dwellers, for example, pay 20% more for rice, 10% more for medicines, and 35% more for water than middle-income people. And finally, the size of the challenge in meeting the Millennium Development Goals absolutely requires the engagement of the private sector. To meet the MDGs for water, for example, means connecting 275,000 people every day between now and 2015. Anybody that thinks that that's going to be done through public sector investment alone has some more thinking to do. So the articulation of clear goals, in this case the MDGs, has actually forced us in the UN to grapple with the critical importance of partnerships and to recognize that without working through partnerships, these goals are pure rhetoric. And if I may say so, seeing my former boss, Bill Draper, over there, who was the gentleman who introduced the private sector to UNDP, and I dare say probably a lot of the UN about 10 or 15 years ago, I can only say it took us a while, but we're catching up. Let me end, if I could, with a few comments about UNDP specifically, very few. UNDP is present in about 140 countries, and we do, in a sense, represent the global development network of the UN. And what I want to share with you really is simply that our vision for this organization is a vision in which we have all these UN offices at the country level that represent platforms for coalitions for change. That is the expression that was used in the Secretary General's report in the year 2000, and I think it captures very well the ambition of what these offices can do. They are present, they have knowledge, they have access, and if they can be used to bring coalitions together, coalitions of partners to execute, to implement these kind of changes that are needed, then I think that that we are doing well. And to give you a few examples, let me start with the Millennium Development Goal reports, a commitment that we have in every country, in every developing country, to have an annual report that measures and tracks the progress against the Millennium Development Goals of that country. And what this is not a report, it's a process. It's a process of fostering democratic accountability and governance at the country level. Because if you produce a report every year, and if those target figures come out very clearly, and it's clear that some things are working and some things are not, that in some neighboring countries it works and in your country it doesn't, that in one province it works and another province it doesn't, you begin to use the power of data to really inform a public and get a very important discussion going about the quality of governance. And let me give you one other example and then stop, and that goes back to the Private Sector Commission. Paul Martin announced on Monday a new partnership between Canada and UNDP, which is a concept which we're going to explore together of the provision of brokerage services at the country level to really try and bring different partners together to stimulate the possibility of entrepreneurial growth. The idea here, one can imagine a number of different types of deals that we could be looking to support. Public-private partnerships for service delivery, new business models to serve what C.K. Prahalad refers to as the bottom of the pyramid, enabling access for SMEs to national and international markets, linking international investors with local entrepreneurs, and facilitating the development of new technologies. This is an initiative which we believe is full of promise. So in conclusion, I believe that partnership is not a passing fad. I believe that it has become truly central to the business model which the United Nations is employing and the business model that we will move forward with. And we will be much the stronger if you join us in these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Our second speaker, and representing the business leg of the stool, is Bo Cutter, and he will detail a project in microfinance. Bo?
Good morning. Before I do anything else, I want to thank John Morgridge and my old friend. Actually, I shouldn't say it that way. I've kind of reached the age when shouldn't do this. My longtime friend, Jane Wales, for including me in what really has been a wonderful forum where I've learned a great deal. And let me congratulate Mr. Goldman on his remarks. I suspect that for the tiny handful of people in this room who know me, you won't be quite as surprised and delighted if I also come out and say that it's that I'm going to vote Democratic in November. Let me introduce myself. My name, as John said, is Bo Cutter. My day job is noted in your material, and I won't dwell on it. Much more importantly, I have the honor of being on the board of CARE with John Morgridge, serving on that same board with Bill Unger, who's here today somewhere. If my eyes, there's Bill. And under the leadership of Peter Bell, the president of CARE, who's also here today, and with another longtime friend of mine, Catherine Marshall, who's on the CARE's program committee. So we're fairly well represented. And most directly for this morning, I chair an initiative that's launched by several partners. The first is MEDA, the economic development arm of the Mennonite Church, the Rockdale Foundation of Atlanta, and of course CARE, called Microvest, which is intended to be an independent, for-profit, sustainable business, raising private capital, I hope some of yours, investing in microfinance, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But let me start by, since partnership has been the theme of yesterday and today, and it's so central to what we're trying to do, let me start by suggesting 3 levels at which it matters to us. At the basic level, we're trying to build a business. And ultimately what that business has to do is bring together private investors with entities, microfinance institutions, investing and lending to some of the poorest people in the world. And we're trying to do the basic blocking and tackling that allows, that every great business has done, to create an association, a true kind of partnership with our ultimate partners. At the next level, we need to do this in concert with good institutions that are trying to do much the same thing and were here before we were. I have in mind organizations like ShoreCap, which is represented here by my long-term friend Jan Piercy, and Axion, whose president Maria Otero is also here. In the purest sense of Gordon Conway's terms yesterday, all of what we try to do cannot work unless we do deals together. And finally, at the third level, we have to build a financial sector together. If microfinance is truly to be a force for ending poverty, rather than a few wonderful anecdotes, then we have to build all of the elements of true financial markets serving the poor. Now, I want to proceed from here by asking and answering quickly 3 questions. What are we ultimately trying to do? What are we doing now and what do we want? And where are we going? I'll start with what are we ultimately trying to do. Microfinance, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, involves the lending or investing of very small amounts of capital to very poor people in developing economies around the world. It's sustainable because it rests on the poignant fact that very poor people who borrow money pay it back. We're raising capital for microfinance and for those people. At a basic level, we're doing something that is simultaneously extremely concrete and at the same time extremely uplifting. Every time I visit the farms, the villages, the associations, the poorest parts of the cities of developing economies, I am absolutely blown away by the creativity, the innovation, the energy, the drive of the women and the men that we're trying to work with. What's missing is capital. We are building sustainable businesses that attempt to provide the capital that enables individual women and men to transform their own lives. And finally, and not to dwell on it, I think of this effort as correcting a deep contradiction in our own economic system. Our system sees capital as the engine of economic growth and of individual freedom. All of us are here today and have funds to give away or invest because of the force of capital. But for the most part, we've not built into our development theories, or we've not built development theories that see enough of a role for capital markets and freedom in ending poverty in developing economies. Those of us involved in these efforts to build and transform microfinance are trying to start small entities that will sum to very large changes. What are we doing right now and what do we want? We're creating institutions that will raise real, non-governmental, private capital and invest it in microfinancial institutions in developing economies around the world. We're defining our institutions as for-profit businesses, albeit a smaller profit than your previous businesses or Warburg Pincus earned, run as real businesses with all of the focus on accountability and financial stewardship that this implies. We're building businesses that will yield a return to investors and therefore, we hope, allow progressively greater access to larger amounts of capital. And we're trying to fill a fundamental financial gap that's faced by microfinance. The field has existed for 25 years or so. Many local institutions have been created. If you count them all up, it's in the thousands. The world doesn't really need another local institution. But over that period, only about $1 billion in capital has been raised. Virtually all of that is public money, and virtually all of it is debt. The whole field is only sustainable if access to real capital can begin to be established. As one example, my institution, Microvest, has been raising private capital for our first fund since last April. In January of this year, we announced our first fund closing of $15.4 million. Between now and next December, we want to raise $10 million more. This suggests what we want. We don't want grants. We don't want donations. We want you to invest in us. As Jan Piercy said so clearly yesterday, we want you to think of development and philanthropy as in part, instruments of investment. And finally, where are we going? I think all of us, regardless of the metaphors we use, have a pretty common vision. We want to build real financial markets that work for the poor. We want to create serious financial institutions and real businesses. We want to create a full range of securities, mobilize real capital, convince financial regulators and central banks and developing economies to see microfinance institutions as a true part of their financial sectors, be seen by international players such as the World Bank, the UNDP, the IFC, as entities attempting to build true markets. None of this is easy. I'm a senior partner in a good private equity firm. There are others around the room. And building Microvest is as hard an act of entrepreneurship as I've seen or attempted. And I suspect that Jan Piercy or Maria Otero would agree. Well, why? First, it's always hard to start anything new. But in this case, together we have to build all of the elements of a functioning market simultaneously. We have to convince other players, central banks, the World Bank, regulators, that there is a place for these new institutions, and we have to convince others to bridge what's a cultural divide between giving and investing. But it is going to succeed. What our ultimate customers themselves have shown and proven is that it's possible to build sustainable institutions that allow them the freedom to realize their own dreams. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Bo. And now the last of our three panelists representing what most of us represent, philanthropy, is Iqbal.
Thank you, John. Good morning. I feel honored and privileged to be on a panel with such distinguished people as Bruce Jenks and Bo Cutter, and to have John Morgridge as our moderator. But I also feel very fortunate and privileged to be in a room full of people that care about the same thing, how to make this a better world. So thank you for having me here. I want to do two things. I want to give you very quickly an overview of the organization that I represent, and then talk about one very critical partnership, without which much of what we are trying to do would not be possible. I represent the Aga Khan Foundation, which is part of a network of institutions that are sponsored by His Highness the Aga Khan. For simplicity's sake, I would say that we are two foundations, the Aga Khan Foundation and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Two universities, the Aga Khan University, the president of which, Dr. Shams Qasim Lakha, is here with us today, and the new University of Central Asia. We have three service companies that deliver health, education, and building and planning services, and a development fund which is commercially oriented, for-profit, and works in developing countries in order to create jobs, in order to add value to exports, in order to stimulate the economy, and bring some permanent, durable change in the economic life of the people in those countries. We work in 30 different countries. We are sponsored by His Highness the Aga Khan, who is the 49th hereditary Imam of the Shia Imami Ismaili Muslims. But we are a non-denominational organization that serves the benefits of all, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, or political persuasion. The Arakan Development Network is composed of 800 or more programs and entities and employs about 50,000 people, roughly half on the for-profit side and another half on the not-for-profit side. In addition to thousands and thousands of volunteers who actually make our work more cost-effective, efficient, and sustainable in the countries where we function. Our genesis in the modern era goes back to the 1880s when the grandfather of the present Aga Khan, Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan, mobilized his community of followers on the notion of self-help, taking care of their basic needs in health, in education, and income generation. And the institutions that were begun in the 1880s with very progressive thinking, such as telling his followers that if you have limited resources and you have to choose between educating your sons or your daughters, educate your daughters first, because that will ensure the success of the family. They've grown from community-based self-help organizations to national institutions in many of the countries where we work, and there are some 30 countries. Partnerships are something we live with, we know about, because they are the cornerstone and an intrinsic part of how the Arakan Development Network functions. Each of these entities within the Arakan Development Network has a separate mandate, has autonomous management, has its own governance, but they're bound together by a common set of principles, values, and an ethical framework. So making deals is something we do every day of our lives, whether it's the Arakan Foundation working with the Arakan University, whether it's the Arakan University working with the Arakan Health Services. But beyond the Arakan Development Network, we work with some 60+ international organizations, without whose support, collaboration, and work, much of what we do would never be possible. So we work at multiple levels. We work with national governments. It's a necessary part of doing that if you're going to be in the countries where you work. With multilateral and bilateral organizations, with foundations, with NGOs, with corporations. But the one partnership that is absolutely critical from our experience to our success and success of many other organizations is to work with beneficiaries and communities at the grassroots level. These are the people whose lives we are trying to change. These are the people we are helping to help them change their lives. And without their full engagement and involvement, none of what we try to do would ever come to pass. A simple example, not so simple, but an important example, is the work that we began in the northern areas in Pakistan some 20 years ago, working with the people who live in the isolated mountain valleys in northern areas of Pakistan, Hunza, Gilgit, Chitral, and so on. Our basic principle was to help people organize themselves so that they can be the engines of change in their lives. We helped them create social organizations called village organizations. But we got them organized around economic activities, because what we had learned prior to that if you organize people around social activities, they don't stay organized very long. When you organize them around activities that would help generate more income, that create some direct tangible benefits from them, then there are incentives for them to remain organized. And once they do that, the incentives are there for them to move further along the development continuum, whether it is getting basic education for their girls and boys, basic health care, and so on, to building a local institution that becomes more efficient in demanding services from governments at the local level, at the district level. So in the process, you not only bring the government as a partner, but make the government services more efficient. What we've seen happen in that area is it's impacted about 1.2 million people. There are more than 3,000 village organizations that have been formed. They truly are the voice of democracy at the grassroots level, because these are people voting for their own futures. This is democracy in action, when people have a voice and when they have a choice. Our role in that has been to help them make informed choices. It is not telling them what to do, because they bring the local expertise, the local knowledge, and an understanding of their own needs, their own challenges, and how to resolve them. So what do these people want from us? and how is it important for us to work at the local level. Let me step back a little. We've heard a lot about partnerships yesterday and today, and you've heard of the many good reasons why we should all partner and why partnerships are important, from leveraging of ideas and resources to creating sustainable local capacity and so on. There are two other reasons that I've not heard, and I'd like to put them forward. One is about going to scale. If you're going to make an impact and reach the largest number of people in developing countries, then scale matters. And in order to get to scale, we have to partner with multiple players across multiple organizations. The second is replication. We might support a small program somewhere and an approach works, but the adaptation of that approach and the replication of that in order for it to have the greatest impact requires partnerships. Unless we join hands with different kinds of organizations, the replication is not going to occur. But to go back to the story about the northern areas in Pakistan, these people who 20 years ago were completely isolated and poor, and no commercial bank would want to deal with them, are today shareholders in Pakistan's first microfinance bank. They saved $1 a day, accumulated $10 million in savings, and the first for-profit microfinance bank in Pakistan is now partially owned by these villages from the northern areas. What do these partnerships require? They require an ability to listen. They require a long-term commitment. They have to know that people who have come in to help them improve their own lives are going to be with them, not just for the duration of a grant, 3 years or 5 years, but for several decades. That helps make them confident about their future. They also need support structures, structures that help them widen their own vision of their future. I have yet to come across a poor farmer, man or woman, who does not want the same things that we want for our children. Incidentally, in many of the countries where we work, I have yet to come across a father who does not want to educate his daughter, so long as it is done within the cultural and societal environment in which the family lives. I have yet to come across a mother whose pain at losing a child is any different from any other mother anywhere else, regardless of their faith. So they're all looking to improve their lives. We have to accept, acknowledge, and build on the pluralism of these societies. Economic development helps reduce the divisiveness that creeps into societies because of differences of race, religion, or any other factor. One has to both accept it and promote it. But most of all, we have to believe in the power of the people to change their own lives. We have to believe that the strongest engine for change in the world are the people who we're trying to help. And I'm glad so many of you in this room are willing to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move to your part of the program where where the panel entertains your questions. And we'll do it as we did yesterday. Just raise your hand. We'll try and get a microphone to you. And please specify who on the panel you're addressing your question to. While we're getting the microphone there, perhaps I could ask the first question, and I'll ask this of Bo. One of the things we've struggled with at Cisco is this idea of the mix and the balance between philanthropy and good business. And once you say that you're going to target that sweet spot, then the business in us asks, well, how good a business is this? How good a business investment is this? And I would think that the same question is applied to you by your investors.
Absolutely. I ought to say that I found the panel yesterday afternoon that moved to this topic that was moderated by Bill Unger to be extraordinarily interesting and educational. But we face, and I think anybody in this business, in this effort, faces these pressures on both sides of the spectrum. On the one hand, You don't want, you can't cherry pick. You can't move to the you can't essentially pile on to the few institutions in the world that can raise capital by themselves, yield decent returns, have essentially already made it. And on the other hand, there is a limit to the amount of risk that you can accept. By choosing to be to do what we're trying to do, and what, as I've already said, others in this room have already begun to try to do, we've accepted the fact that there's a ceiling to the rate of return. This isn't a pure business investment, but it is going to yield a return. And within the constraints of what we've already accepted, we have to manage that tension on both sides and build a great business within those parameters.
All right, thank you. And I think, where do we have the microphone? In the back? Very fine. Please state your name and organization, and then your question.
Thank you. My name is Jed Emerson. I'm a lecturer here at the Business School at Stanford and a senior fellow with the Hewlett and the Packard Family Foundations. I thought the last two speakers were very eloquent in describing the need for new capital to come in and really provide that next stage of financing and the creation of the capital markets. And yet most foundations only leverage 5% of their assets to actually advance their institutional mission, and 95% of their assets are in standard traditional market rate investments. If the partnership is really going to go forward, it seems that the foundation community has got to look at how to leverage other forms of investing out of their corpus into these types of deals and these sorts of instruments that you're describing. And I just would be interested in hearing the last two speakers comment on what kind of responses you're getting from the foundation community and as you engage them in these kind of discussions. Are they saying, well, go talk to our program officer here and don't talk to our investment managers on the other end of the building? Or like, what kind of reaction are you getting from people as you engage them in this?
You want to start?
All right. We haven't approached any foundations to invest with us in microfinance endeavors because so I can't answer your question directly. The umbrella organization within the Arakan Development Network that does microfinance on a commercial basis is the Arakan Fund for Economic Development, and their frequent partner in most of their ventures, whether microfinance or others, is the International Finance Corporation. The model in Pakistan is unique because they brought in beneficiaries and their savings contribute to part of the equity. And so I cannot answer your question directly.
I can make a shot. Again, at the panel yesterday, at the breakout session yesterday afternoon, Jan Piercy referred specifically to this problem, and I referred to it obliquely and I suspect obscurely when I talked about the cultural divide. It's precisely as you've indicated, that if one goes up one line, and this is also true with individual potential high net worth investors in something like this, if you go up one line, the program line, what we're proposing, and others like me, I don't want to personalize it, isn't quite it isn't a donation, it isn't a grant. And so it seems a little peculiar on that side. If you go up another line, you're dealing with the financial types like me, and this damn sure isn't that. And trying to create a bridge of that is really very, very hard. And I'll give you just one sense of numbers in terms of hit rates. In my day job, when we raise a fund, our hit rate is probably about 80%. That 80% of the people we talk to invest in what we do. We did 200 presentations, give or take, in the first year for Microvest, and our hit rate was about 21%. And it wasn't because we're not good at doing presentations. It's good. It's a hard sell.
Probably because it's a new concept. Yes,
Yeah.
over here.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm Kurt Huffman. I look after the Shell Foundation in London, and also I look after the group's social investment activities in about 100 countries. And I'd like to make a few observations on the presentations this morning, as well as some of the themes that have been running through the last few days. Add a bit of fine grain based on our experience, and certainly ask anybody on the panel to pick it up. The first observation is there was particularly this morning some good focus on the need to increase the amount of capital available. And one point I want to make is that let's not forget, though, that there is a good deal of local capital available. It's just very risk averse. So in countries like Uganda and South Africa, the Shell Foundation has pursued a strategy of trying to find local banks who are prepared to go at risk with us in creating venture funds for investment in small enterprises. And it's been very successful. We've had to get through the sort of tendency that they look for softer money and support from the international side. But what you get when you get local capital involved is local knowledge, local cost base, local ability to carry out risk assessments, all of those things that when you bring international capital in, you don't always get it. You get international costs, international knowledge, which is not the same as local knowledge. So I just want to urge everyone not to forget that there is capital available, even in very poor countries, but it's very risk averse, and we have to find ways to harness that, because eventually it's the local capital, investment capital, that's going to carry this forward. The second point I'd like to make is on the issue of scaling up, and I was very glad to hear that point been raised this morning in a number of places. But the point has been made that we need other partners to help scale things up, in the sense that we need more capital and more resources to scale up. That's true. But the scaling up challenge goes beyond additional capital. It's about how you manage the scale up process, how you manage the business of going from a pilot enterprise or a pilot initiative to something that operates at national level or international level. And that's a real challenge. That's a management challenge, that there aren't a lot of entities around other than large companies who have had the experience of scaling things up. So when you're looking to partnerships, particularly with the private sector, to get involved in this scaling up business, there's going to be particular assets and value there in the business of scaling up and rolling out, and managing supply chains, and managing that whole process. So that's another key thing. And the third point I'd like to make really relates to the nature of partners and partnership. We do a lot of partnering. We do a lot of engaging, particularly with the NGO community and nonprofits and academic institutions, trying to find groups who can be partners with us in carrying out what are often sort of business-oriented, market-oriented investments. And we find that many of them, and it's not really their fault, but many of them, particularly when you begin to talk about creating sustainable economic developments, creating sustainable businesses, micro-business on the ground, they're good at walking the walk, talking the talk, and they can read that in the books, and they can assimilate the knowledge. But when it comes to walking the walk, when it comes to being able to manage for success in the sort of delivery goals that we approach, they tend to lack what we might call enterprise DNA, the sense of risk assessment and business sense, and a whole range of really basic tools, not rocket science, but basic knowledge of how to manage for success and do all the things that you need to do before you get a profit when you're a business. It's not their fault, because of course they're in a market that's not always driven by those sentiments. They're in a market that's driven by many of the donors who are here, who don't apply to them requirements for reporting and performance, don't apply sanction in the sense that if you don't meet your interim performance target, you pull the grant. I don't know how often that happens, but I mean, it's applying that sort of thinking that forces the delivery mechanisms, the NGOs and the nonprofits, to really focus on getting success. So I think there's a challenge to the donor community in particular to think about, they're the market makers. How do they structure this market that the NGOs go to for their funds in order to get them to focus not on the success of raising more money for the next project, but on delivering success on the ground. Thanks very much.
Just maybe I could make a quick two comments. On the issue of scaling up, I think that Iqbal was right on when he talked about the importance of the of the government partnership and the enabling environment and the legislative framework. Because in the end, the biggest, what did I do? The biggest scaler up is policy. It's legislated policy, budget allocations. It's what governments or national authorities do in a particular area. And I think that that's an extremely important part of this equation. The other part of this is with regard to the need for domestic private sector investment. And this is one of the critical issues which is at the heart of this private sector commission report. If you look at the flows, the heart of the matter does lie in what happens in the domestic market. There are very important linkages, but the domestic market is what actually drives it. And I think that what we need to look at in particular is this issue of how you manage risk in these environments where people are very cautious about moving forward. And certainly from our side, the area where we think we can make a contribution is in the management of risk. I suspect that part of the answer to how you bridge a private sector calculation with a philanthropic motivation is in the area of managing those risks so that you help to bridge that. And I think that's a very important function, and that brokerage function which I talked about is indeed an attempt to respond to that issue.
Right here.
I'm Steve Tosa with the Noor Family Foundation in Menlo Park. I'd like to pose a question to Bo Cutter and Iqbal Noor related to the dark side of microenterprise. I was in Cambodia with our Family Foundation 2 weeks ago. There was a prominent feature in Phnom Penh Daily describing several tragic stories of borrowers in microcredit deals that for various personal reasons were unable to repay their loans. Husband got sick, the loan proceeds were paid to buy medicine. Tools purchased with the loan were stolen. Years of trying to make payment on the debt came to naught. Yesterday I had breakfast here with a gentleman from South Africa who stated that microenterprise in South Africa is a disaster. It seems to me that this is the kind of story that is seldom reported in this country, and I'd be interested in your comments on what consideration you're giving to the problems, the challenges of these mechanisms in the developing world, and whether you see there to be a need for supporting social institutions that can buffer in some way against these kinds of unfortunate outcomes.
You want to start?
Thank you, Steve. In our programs, I haven't heard very much about these kinds of issues, but this is why it is important that microfinance and microenterprise not be a standalone activity. It needs to be part of an integrated approach to development. And when you provide for good health care, education, all of that leads to sustainable economic development. There is one innovative sort of an approach that we've taken to the first microfinance banks program in the urban areas of Karachi, where the Arkan University is involved, where with the help of a corporate foundation, they've set up a fund that insures them against health risks. For instance, if a borrower runs into some hazardous health conditions and needs health care, the Arkan University Hospital will provide that based on their welfare fund. And then the payments that the borrower has to make back on the loans can be deferred or, in some cases, written off. In my little experience as microfinance banks that we've set up, the first one in Pakistan, the next one in Afghanistan, it seems that there is that need for social capital that is not looking for a return on investment until the banks get established. There's a subsidy period of the first 3 years that involves training, that involves putting in the right kind of management information systems, and so on. Now, other experiences could be different, but the importance of this being part of a larger program, a more comprehensive program, where you have the safety nets, where you have the other social structures, such as the Arkan Rural Support Program, which had the Savings and Credit Program as a part of its activity and not a standalone activity, is rather important, I think.
I'll try to say it in 4 declarative sentences, and so others can ask a question. First, much of what you've said is part of the inherent problem that you can't get everything into the theme sentence, which is to say that there's clearly a need for substantial integration in any set of development programs, and there are needs for institutions that do that. They don't exist everywhere, and you have to start where you can start. I mean, you are where you are. Second, I've visited and walked with loan officers in 3 continents, several countries, in terms of the kind of trying to watch what they do and ask those kinds of questions. And all of them, within the range of the possible, attempt to manage that kind of problem rather than destroy someone's credit or the confidence his neighbors have in him or her if they're late on a loan, so that there's a clear understanding by the institutions and the individual loan officers that this is an issue that has to be managed. I ought to also say, though, that what I'm struck by is the significant sense on the part of the borrowers or the investees of an obligation to pay back. Third, I think all of us increasingly recognize that as associated with what we do within the constraints that John asked me the question earlier, that we think of as an enterprise, we're going to have to raise developmental funds that are going to be grant-like to build the institutions and build around them. And finally, we are in the process of negotiating many insurance packages of precisely the kind that Iqbal mentioned, to deal with some of the risks that you can recognize, like health risks.
I'm by no means an expert, but my observations from visits is, number one, most of the good programs include education as part of it, and it's an important part. And the second is, there are certain kinds of loans that are very high risk, one of which are agricultural seed loans, because the expectation is if the crop fails, I don't pay it back. And I think our government has learned that, and people in this field probably have too. One last question. Over here. Lady in blue.
Greetings. I'm Jane Yett. I'm an individual donor from Santa Cruz, associated with Changemakers and the Global Fund for Women. If we accept that there is a financial advantage in pairing enterprise and social programs, such as grassroots organizing and microfinance, how do we prevent the conflicts of interest that can arise between business and social programs when, for example, the enterprise may seek to grow, to control its funds, to control the advantages for those who are associated with the enterprise part, whether they're investors or staff, directors, and the nonprofit part, which may have very different interests and perhaps want more transparency, etc. It seems that the Aga Khan Foundation is addressing this in part by having the enterprise be the grassroots itself. But can there be built in a balance of power into the structure such that there are poor people on the board of the enterprise or the grassroots people, and enterprise people on the board of the social program, etc.? How do you manage that problem? This is to Bo Cutter.
Without trying to argue at all that we've identified all of the conflicts or thought them all through completely or particularly well, to some degree, an institution like SureCap or like Microvest or like Axion, it kind of accept and deal in a way with that most inherent conflict by creating the enterprise itself. I mean, let's just take Microvest, that its interest is in building this particular area. It's not in It's not a partner with another corporation, for example, that may have other strategic interests, which are perfectly legitimate, but pose a different problem of bridging. Where a potential conflict can occur within the heart of an institution, again, I'm wary of Jane's concerns expressed yesterday that we not pitch too much, but of an institution like Microvest, is that we don't want, and I would think our investors don't want us to begin to move toward the direction of saying, well, now that we've got the investors in this fine little institution, let's maximize rate of return and forget the constraints on the other side. And so that we're including significant NGO representation on the board. And we do have significant founder investors, CARE, META, that we're going to have to that we have to report to, and we think that transparency is going to be extremely important over time in saying precisely what we've done and how we've struck that balance. But I agree with you entirely that those tensions are always going to be there.
We thank you for your indulgence in going a little bit over. The break goes until 10:15. Two announcements. First, there is a Plymouth with its lights on in the parking lot next door. Its plate number is 4U01406. The breakout sessions will be on the other side of the building. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.